Hello friends. Today we're going to talk about registering as a sole proprietor in Montenegro. First, let me start with the most important thing. Never register as a sole proprietor in Montenegro. Open a company in Montenegro instead. That's what everyone does. I haven't seen anyone wanting to register as a sole proprietor in Montenegro for probably 8 years now. But nevertheless, many people still ask me how to register as a sole proprietor in Montenegro and why they should open a company instead. They say we'd actually prefer to register as a sole proprietor. So I decided to talk about this in detail today. To start, I'll list the main advantages that people mention when they want to register as a sole proprietor. How things are with a company versus how they are with a sole proprietorship. People usually say the following. As a sole proprietor, you can do your own accounting, so you don't need to pay an accountant. If a sole proprietor is actually conducting business, not just set up for residency purposes, the taxes are lower for sole proprietors. And it's also easier to open and close a sole proprietorship. Yes, all of that is true, but nevertheless, being a sole proprietor has some very serious drawbacks that completely outweigh all the advantages I just mentioned. And it's not even certain that those advantages really exist at all. And that's what we're going to talk about in detail right now. So, the first opinion, sole proprietors pay lower taxes. Let's switch to my computer and take a look at the taxes for sole proprietors in Montenegro. Sole proprietor taxes depend on two factors. The first is which group your sole proprietorship belongs to. And secondly, it depends on the size of the revenue of this private enterprise. Well, I think the revenue part is clear to everyone. There are three options, up to 6,000, up to 12,000, and up to 18,000. What are these groups? These include various emergencies depending on the type of activity. The first group includes taxi drivers, fishermen, millers, beekeepers, and other similar businesses. This also includes home-based activities, gathering medicinal plants and berries. The second group includes auto transport up to 8 tons, taxis, minibuses, market trading, renting out apartments, gardening, breeding and selling ornamental birds, production of stamps and seals, mechanics, metalworking, masons, florists, vulcanization, poultry farming, technical maintenance of running engines, roofers, key making, bag production, sewing machine repair, agricultural equipment repair, and other similar activities. The third group includes auto transport with a maximum load capacity of more than 8 tons, kebab shops, meat curing, alarm system installation, auto painters, masons, painters, carpenters, household appliance repair, technical maintenance of central heating, elevators, and other similar types of activities. In the fourth group, lawyers, traders, public catering, accounting services, auditors, other professional and intellectual activities, confectioners, bakeries, bakers, designers, stylists, hairdressers, makeup artists, and so on. As you can see, there are two types of taxes, imputed and fiscal obligations. They are combined. That is, in some cases it's zero, in others it's a certain amount. So if you take the total percentage, for example, from 18,000, add this plus that, it turns out that indeed the taxes are lower than for a company. So it seems they didn't deceive us. But let's go further and take a look. The second advantage, you can do the accounting yourself, meaning you don't have to pay an accountant. Yes, that's true, you can. But in fact, you can also do the accounting for a company yourself. Again, if you know how. And you can do the accounting for a sole proprietorship yourself, if you know how. Yes, for a sole proprietorship, it is much simpler than for a company. There, basically, you only keep one book of income and expenses. But at the same time, a lot of questions arise. And even if you know the language, you need to spend some time figuring things out. And if you don't know the language, it's even more difficult to do. Unless, of course, you have a friend who knows all this well and can explain everything to you clearly and in detail. What kind of questions are these? For example, where do you get this book? Do you need to register it with the tax office? When do you have to pay the tax? How, what, where do you pay the tax, and how do you fill out the payment slip for submitting the tax? How do you bring yourself and your employee, if you have employees, to the tax office? Do taxes depend on the number of employees? How do you get a health booklet? How do you set up fiscalization? There are quite a lot of questions that come up. And while things are really simpler here when it comes to a company, just try, even if you know the language, to figure out all these issues. And if you don't know the language, it's almost impossible to do. In short, in theory, you can manage without an accountant. In practice, I seriously doubt that any of you will be able to do it. The next advantage that everyone always mentions is that it's easier to open and close a sole proprietorship. Yes, that's very true. But you won't be opening or closing a sole proprietorship yourself for the simple reason that you don't know how to do it. You'll come to me for that. And essentially, it doesn't matter to you at all how many documents I prepare for opening or closing, one or say five. So, in other words, it's not your headache, it's mine. Accordingly, it's absolutely irrelevant for you. Now let's move on to the main questions. Simplified taxation, or as it's called here, increased taxation, or to put it in Russian terms, is probably best translated as imputed tax. That is what you actually saw in the table I showed. This is only possible until your annual revenue reaches 18,000 euros, which for an operating business in general basically means nothing. In other words, it's really not much. Almost everyone, no matter what you do, almost everyone has annual revenue exceeding 18,000 euros. And if your revenue exceeds that amount, meaning if your revenue is more than 18,000 euros, then both your taxation and reporting requirements are the same as for a company. In other words, you lose what is probably the main and perhaps the only advantageous slightly lower tax rate. For you, this will soon become irrelevant. Next. By opening a sole proprietorship, you also take on some significant disadvantages. For example, a sole proprietorship can only have one type of activity. With a company, we can list virtually all types of activities in the charter, except for probably about 3 dozen that cannot be included until the appropriate license is obtained. These are major types of activities such as banks, insurance companies, schools, universities, and so on. They cannot be included in the charter until you have the necessary permit. Everything else is included in our charters. A sole proprietorship can only have one type of activity. And again, most people are engaged in various types of activities. Even if you are in retail, you might, for example, be selling, say, condoms, Coca-Cola, and sausages. Well, retailing, what else could there be? There could be several dozen types of activities, meaning the different products that are offered, for example, in a typical supermarket. But here, you can only have one type of activity. And most importantly, the reason why everyone stopped opening sole proprietorships, even if the business isn't operating, even just for obtaining a residence permit. The thing is, to get a residence permit through a sole proprietorship, you need to obtain permission from the city administration to conduct a specific type of activity. It sounds harmless, but as always, the devil is in the details. To get this permission, you need to rent an office. First of all, you already need to rent an office, even though, in reality, not everyone who runs a business actually needs an office. Yes, as you can see, I have an office, I really do need it. But many people don't need one. If someone is, say, doing programming or design or just making cakes at home to order and then delivering them, they basically don't need an office. But here, an office is required. First, you have to rent it. But if you are renting out an office, that means you are already planning for an annual revenue of more than 18,000 euros. So again, this 18,000 euro limit just doesn't work for you. Besides all that, even if you rent an office, you still won't solve the problem, because to obtain this permit under the first three tax groups, you must have a residence permit. So it turns into a vicious circle. To get a residence permit, you already need to have a residence permit. So that's how it is. Someone probably didn't think about this, the fate of foreigners who might want to open a sole proprietorship. It turned out to be very complicated. The only way to get around this restriction, though, get a permit by renting an office without having a residence permit, is through the fourth and most expensive tax group, which again doesn't suit everyone. Let me remind you that this group includes lawyers, traders, food service providers, accounting services, auditors, and other professional intellectual activities, confectioners, bakers, designers, surveyors, hairdressers, makeup artists, and similar professions. So for some people this might be suitable, but for others not. In other words, the range of business activities you can open is already severely limited. For example, if you want to become a taxi driver, you won't be able to open a taxi business. Or rather, you can technically open it, but you won't be able to obtain a residence permit based on registering a sole proprietorship with the activity type taxi. And this is truly a major problem. And it completely outweighs all the advantages. Yes, in some municipalities you might not encounter this issue right now. Here's the thing, as you can understand, The laws are the same throughout Montenegro, but locally they are often interpreted differently. There have been many such cases, especially when it comes to obtaining a residence permit. For example, in Herceg-Novi, not so long ago, probably about 2 years ago, it was possible to obtain a residence permit using an electronic certificate of no criminal records. Nowhere else in Montenegro were electronic certificates of no criminal record accepted anymore. But in Herceg-Novi, they still were. Well, eventually, someone probably had a word with them, and our municipal office also said, that's it, we no longer accept electronic certificates, only paper ones with a stamp. There were similar examples in other municipalities as well. For instance, in Budva, a few years ago, it was also possible to obtain a residence permit without a certificate from the Ministry of Education. It wasn't allowed anywhere else, but there it was possible. Then it also ended on my birthday. They said, that's it. Now, to obtain and renew, you need a certificate from the Ministry of Education. In Bar, you could get a residence permit without a certificate of no criminal record at all. I don't remember what year it was, but this went on for several years. Then at some point they also said, that's it. The law says we need a certificate of no criminal record. So a certificate of no criminal record is required. So what am I trying to say? That even if in some municipalities you can now come with a sole proprietorship and get a residence permit, it's not guaranteed that, just like in the three examples I just mentioned, it's not guaranteed that at some point they won't start acting strictly according to what is written in the law. And sooner or later you might run into this, if not when you first get your residence permit, then when you renew it. If, for example, they suddenly ask you for this document, at the very least you have to rent an office. And it's possible you could even face very serious problems, including an interruption of your residence permit. So we come back to what I said at the very beginning. There can be problems with residence permits, so just this alone is enough reason to never open a sole proprietorship in Montenegro. Open a company instead, where there are no such problems and none are expected at all. And finally, one last thing. Don't forget that a sole proprietor is liable for their obligations with all of their personal assets. A company is only liable up to the amount of its charter capital, which for most is just €1 high. A sole proprietor is liable with all of their property. In short, guys, I think I've explained this in enough detail now. For many years, I've told everyone many times, never open a sole proprietorship. Don't try to reinvent the wheel, open a company in Montenegro. If your company isn't operating, maintaining a residence permit in Montenegro is much cheaper and easier than in any other European country. If your company is operating, then corporate taxes in Montenegro are the lowest in Europe. You can simply compare the taxes, with any Western European country, and you'll see it for yourself. As the saying goes, don't look for good when you already have it. So there's no need to do what nobody else is doing. If no one is opening a sole proprietorship in Montenegro, there's a reason for that. There are serious reasons for that. I've just tried to explain them to you. My name is Dimitri. You can contact me with any questions about immigration to Montenegro. Goodbye, everyone.